Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here at Politecnico di Torino again, so I'm very grateful for the invitation, the opportunity, and always great to meet a lot of young people and also the formerly young people like me. So let's talk a little bit about the future of Europe in space. This is a little bit of a hot topic. At this time it's being discussed at different levels. And I would love to get you all a little bit excited about this, but at the very least to inform you about what the current discussions are. Let's see, where do I see the time? There you go. All right. So I would like to start by introducing you to some friends of mine, some astronaut colleagues, 3 Americans and a Canadian. She is Christina Cook. She goes by Nana. He's Victor Glover, goes by Ike. Reed Wiseman goes by Tano. And Jeremy Hansen goes by Weed. So Nana, Ike, Weed, and Tano are the Artemis 2 crew. They are going to be, if all goes by plan, within a couple of years, the first human beings in many decades who venture beyond low Earth orbit on the Artemis 2 mission. Of course, as many of you probably know, how many of you are Politecnico? Like almost everyone? Okay, how many people are not engineers, not engineering students, and not Politecnico? Okay, there's a few, all right. Good to know. So they are going to launch on this rocket, the SLS rocket. It flew once so far, a few months ago, on the Artemis 1 mission. So you see it taking off. It's the most powerful rocket currently in service, although that might change quite soon. And they will fly on this vehicle. It's called Orion. And, of course, we like to underline here in Europe that it carries a European service module, or this part here in the back is the service module and is provided by ESA. So that's a pretty exciting thing. I mean, NASA has a vehicle to bring humans beyond low Earth orbit, and actually half of that vehicle is produced in Europe. So that certainly speaks to the quality of our partnership and of our industry. For those of all who are interested, here there's a little bit of a breakdown of what a service module entails. But basically, you know, you've got the pressurized part up here. That's where you will see the photos of the astronauts floating one day on the Artemis 2 mission. And then you've got this service part at the bottom, the service module, which obviously has structure, thermal avionics, arrays for power, all the consumables, and the propulsion. Another big element of this whole architecture of going back to the moon after a few decades is the Gateway. The Gateway is a space station, much smaller than the International Space Station that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but also located much further out in orbit around the moon. And on this slide here is a little bit clearer. We can see what the elements are that, again, are provided by ESA. Here you've got the iHub, the International Habitat, the XPRI communication system, and the XPRI refueling module. I think you guys should probably be particularly attached to the iHub because the industrial leadership is here in Torino with Thales Alenia Space, and in fact, it's going to be basically built here in Torino. So there's going to be a piece of our moon space station made in Torino. Other elements of this moon, let's say, architecture, moon endeavor, as far as ESA is concerned, is a cargo lander. It's called Argonaut, and the industrial contracts for that are going to be placed in the next few months. It's going to be able to land about 1.5 tons on the surface of the moon. And then something a little bit different, a little bit new. It's called Moonlight, and that's an endeavor to put a network of satellites in orbit around the moon to provide communication and navigation, all those things that we take very much for granted on Earth that are dependent on space-based assets, on satellites. We want to replicate that kind of service to the moon, you know, with the idea that as there's going to be more and more traffic on the moon in the next decades, we have that capability on the moon surface as well. And just one slide looking even further away. Of course, the other important destination in the solar system is Mars. And so we shouldn't forget ExoMars. It's this European mission with the Rosalind Franklin rover that will explore the surface of Mars, looking for traces of life, including drilling into the soil. And of course, there is a very complex endeavor called Mars Sample Return to actually return samples of Martian soil to Earth. And that's a joint endeavor between NASA and ESA that will, span probably the next decade before, those samples can be brought back. So, as you can see, we have a very strong participation, a very strong partnership in all of these endeavors of exploration beyond low Earth orbit. So, all good, all great, nothing to worry about. Maybe, let's see. So, we went to the moon, we even went to take a peek. Was I supposed to do this in English? Yes. Yeah, okay, good. For a moment I had a doubt. I was like, maybe they're shy, they're not telling me. Okay. So we went to the moon and a little bit to Mars. And so I'm gonna pull you back on Earth to a day about a little bit more than a year ago. This is us, my crew and I. As you might remember, I was in space a year ago for the Minerva mission. And this is where we landed, the day that we landed at Kennedy Space Center in Florida to go and launch. This is the view that we had from the airplane of our launch pad down there. And we landed there after a significant delay. We were supposed to come quite a lot earlier, but our launch date kept slipping and slipping. And then when we finally got to Kennedy Space Center, we were supposed to launch 4 or 5 days later, and it ended up being maybe like 10 days later, so we've ended up staying a lot longer. And the reason is those guys here had to free our parking spot on orbit. They were up there for the very first private astronaut mission to the International Space Station, and we had to wait for them to come back. Well, first of all, we had to wait for them to launch, so our launch kept slipping because their launch kept slipping. And then when they finally were on board, we had to wait for them to have a landing opportunity, and because the winds were so strong, it took them about a week, an extra week, until they finally had a landing opportunity to come back so that we could launch to space. So, pretty regular persons, except for the fact that I have very deep pockets, except Michael Lopez Alegria, who is a former professional astronaut. The other 3 are billionaires of different countries who purchased a ticket to go to the International Space Station. How did they do that? Or what is Axiom? I think you probably understood. I mean, they had an opportunity through this company that is called Axiom, a private enterprise. Axiom is a company that was founded a few years ago by a former project manager of the International Space Station at NASA, with the ultimate goal of building a space station that is going to operate in low Earth orbit. Eventually, there will be no ISS, no International Space Station anymore, probably in 2030. And so the idea is to have private space stations operate in low Earth orbit and provide those opportunities for research in weightlessness that otherwise would go away. So you've got Axiom, you actually have other ones who are competing for that opportunity, for NASA funding for that opportunity. Axiom is probably the one that is more advanced, but you also have 3 more. This is Orbital Reef, and I think the other ones are called Starlab and I don't remember, but there are different consortia of private companies, mostly Americans, with some participation of European companies. Stasi works together with Axiom, for example. And they're basically competing for this opportunity to be the next generation space station. So again, not NASA anymore, not a partnership of agencies like the International Space Station, private companies, again, mostly American. So, while Axiom is waiting for this space station to be built, it doesn't exist yet, or at least not in space. Parts of it are already on the ground. They're basically trying to generate some cash flow by selling flights. They have an agreement to sell flights for private customers on the International Space Station. How do they get people to space station? I mean, they don't have their own space vehicle, right? Well, they do the same thing that I did as an ESA astronaut. They use a Dragon, a SpaceX Dragon. Again, completely different stories from the past. This vehicle with which astronauts are flying to space now is a private vehicle. It belongs to a private company, SpaceX. And SpaceX is free to sell that service of flying to low Earth orbit to NASA, and via NASA, of course, to ESA, or to sell it to private customers like those 4 billionaires. And so you see images like that. You know, remember there used to be that you would drive on the launch pad on a very nondescript crew van where, you know, all the crew would huddle together in that van. Well, now you drive to the launch pad in a Tesla. So that is me waving at my family before launching from a Tesla. You have things like that, free flyer missions. SpaceX has pretty much partnered with this person, also a billionaire, great guy, amazing person, Jared Isaacman, who is basically sponsoring a series of missions. One has already happened, Inspiration 4 was the very first flight of private, non-professional, and non-governmental astronauts, and he footed the bill for the entire flight. And he's doing the same for a series of missions that are called Polaris. The first one is going to be Polaris Dawn, and this is the crew. These 2 ladies, they are SpaceX employees, and this is a buddy of him that he goes to fly military jets with. That's what billionaires do for fun. This is the Axiom 2 mission. So this is continuing. So actually it should launch in a couple of weeks, in 21st or 22nd of May. Again, with a former NASA astronaut, Peggy Whitson, a billionaire who paid for his own ticket. And, however, here it says, I got this from the Axiom website. It's not completely true. It's not privately funded per se as a whole. I mean, John, this guy, certainly paid privately for his ticket. But these 2 guys, or this guy and this girl, they are Saudis, Saudi citizens. They are astronauts of the Saudi Space Commission. So their flight is actually paid by a government, Saudi Arabia. So what you start seeing now is even institutional customers, government astronauts of different countries that didn't used to have maybe their astronauts, their space program, going to buy tickets for their astronauts through those private companies. So to be clear, this is not what we have done at ESA for the last 20 years. We used to. I mean, if you look at the history of human spaceflight in Europe, you kind of have macro phases, right? You've got the 60s and 70s, even I wasn't born there, where, you know, we would just wonder, watch, you know, the astronauts on TV and marvel at these incredible things that they were doing, but it was very far away. And then you've got the 80s, 90s, the early 2000s, where it was kind of like this. You would have governments or institutions paying cash to get opportunities for astronauts to fly. But then we moved on from that. And so through the partnership in the International Space Station, we don't pay for astronauts' flight per se. What we do is we participate in the program. So we finance industrial work, for example, at TASI Alenia Space here in Torino, so that they can produce hardware like the Columbus, the MPLMs, or provide services, and that is a contribution to the program, and in exchange of that, we get opportunities for our astronauts to fly, or for our experiments to be flown, and things like that. So we call that the barter model. We barter, we exchange. I give you this, you give me that. No exchange of cash. Now that this whole low Earth orbit environment is moving onto a commercial system, you have commercial vehicle providers. Soon you will have commercial space station. Well, is that the end of the barter model? I mean, those companies are interested in cash. I mean, they're companies. They want, you know, they're interested in the bottom line. They're probably not interested in bartering things with us necessarily. So what is next? This is the big question. I think, personally, that there's 2 options. I mean, we cannot stay where we are now. It's like this unstable equilibrium point, right? So either we go back to paying cash. You know, we go to those companies and buy tickets for our astronauts, what we did 20 years ago, or we go to the next step and we develop some level of autonomous capability of human spaceflight in Europe. Now, I think it's worth taking a look at what's happening in the rest of the world, right? So you've got the US, a historic space power, nothing new. Well, sort of nothing new. As we've looked into it, it's not anymore government-sponsored vehicle. It's private companies. I mean, we have SpaceX, and then probably there will be Boeing soon, and there's a third one, Sierra Nevada, coming up in the future, most likely. Then, of course, you still have the Russians with their Soyuz, able to send humans into space. Of course, China, in the meantime, has established itself as a very, very capable, very competent human spaceflight actor. And you even got India. I mean, they haven't launched yet, but it's coming soon. They're going to have their own vehicle, their own astronauts, their own human spaceflight program. So the elephant in the room is, where is Europe in all of this, right? What do we want to do? Do we want to be leaders in this new space that is coming, in this new environment of space explorations, or do we want to be passengers? So I think, or at least I've tried to give you an idea that things are changing, and they're changing very fast. There is a proliferation of actors, both governmental actors and private actors, and things are changing at the speed of light. We call it revolution space. There's a report that came out recently from a high-level advisory group, and they called it like that, and we kind of like to use that term, which I think is pretty fitting. Maybe some of you were here yesterday when my Director General talked. I think he also talked about this a little bit. But the point here is that, look, I think we all understand that space is not something that's out there, and it's not about the astronauts flying in space. I mean, it's about what space does for us, right? And I think especially in this room, I'm sure that there is a very high awareness of all the services and the things that are woven in the fabric of our societies and our economies and our prosperity and our security that depend on space. In some of these areas, we can sort of say in Europe that we play in the first league, in the Serie A, we would say in Italian. You know, Earth observation, navigation, communication. I say sort of because if you start digging deep, you realize that there's a lot of technology in those products that we do not necessarily own. We do not own the supply chain of those technologies, so we're not completely autonomous. There is a strong, let's say, vulnerability level also in those areas that sometimes is not super understood. But even if we put that aside and we say, okay, in those areas, applications, communication, navigation, Earth observation, we play at the top. Nobody looks at Europe and say, oh, there's a space power. But not at all. To be a space power, to be able, and what does it mean to be a space power? A space power means you're able to leverage space 360 degrees for your interest, for the benefit of your citizens, for your economy, for your industry, for your security, right? Peace, security, and cooperation, prosperity and wealth, talent and inspiration, sustainable future. Those are the macro areas that were pointed out by this advisory group. If you are not a space power, if you're not able to leverage space for all of those aspects, 360 degrees, then you're always going to be dependent on someone else. You know, the most easy thing is probably the economy. So the space economy is growing fast. There's projections, and this is actually a pretty conservative one. There's others that are much bigger. You know, 1 trillion economy by 2040, which means about 3 times more than it is now. But this growth is due mostly to like these new space companies that are agile, that have low costs, that have very fast hardware development cycles, that really gain market share by disruptive technologies. Like those kind of companies right now, the majority of them are not exactly in Europe. You know, a lot, I mean, there's more. It's coming, no doubt about it. But certainly we are at the time where, you know, we should, you know, keep pushing to not miss the boat. And then at that point, we really only get the crumbs. Geopolitically, right? Again, space is part of our security, of our defense, of our soft power, our projection of a certain image to the rest of the world, our ability to attract partners, to be attractive for partners and allies. All of that is something that space, and in particular human spaceflight, gives you. Now, as they say, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. So do we want to be at the table, or do we want to be on the menu? Do we want that our talented young people, and I'm looking in this audience here, right? You know, people who have talents and competence and education and big dreams and big ambitions, a lot of times they end up leaving. They end up going somewhere else to pursue their dreams, and we don't want that. We want them to stay here. We want an ambitious human spaceflight program that unites Europeans around a common, difficult, challenging, but rewarding goal that gives a projection inside to our own citizens that we are capable to tackle difficult tasks, difficult challenges. And it also projects an image of Europe outside to our partners in the world, of a Europe that is self-assertive, that is not confined itself to a mentality of decline. And so I'm going to leave you with this final slide, which is the revolution space, and in particular, I will add, to have a bold and ambitious human spaceflight program is way, way more than just space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha, so especially for being on time. I think we have possibility to have one question, right? Okay, only one, very short. No one? Okay. Okay.
So thank you, Samantha. It's nice to see you here again. The question is, what do you suggest to move in Europe?
So this is very much the debate that is ongoing, but so what we are going to propose, and hopefully we're able to build some consensus around this, is to have a stepwise approach that slowly, but not slowly, that progressively, but at a fast pace, builds European capabilities. So the most immediate step, and also the easiest one, is obviously access to low Earth orbit with cargo. This is something that partially we've mastered before. We've had a cargo vehicle before, the ATV. I say partially because the ATV re-entered in a destructive way. So we need to master a non-destructive re-entry. So the very first step, and this needs to happen fast, because I mean, I talked about the barter model, right? At the very least, we need that to be able to barter something. If it's not with NASA, then we can, you know, we can have our own private companies in Europe have business-to-business relationship with those commercial providers in the US. But at least from our perspective, we're not going to just send cash over the ocean. So we need to have some capabilities in Europe from European companies that we can work with in order to avoid this mechanism where we start just sending cash over the ocean to have our astronauts fly. So the most immediate step is this one, like cargo to low Earth orbit and back. And back is key because the next step is to send humans, and humans for sure you want them back. I mean, that's kind of nice. And then we need to see where we can fit into the moon architecture of NASA so that we can provide a capability that is key for them as well in that kind of architecture. Transfer to the gateway, transfer from the gateway to the surface, and return of, I think the most immediate one that I think they would be very interested in is a return of samples from the gateway to Earth. So those are obviously ongoing discussions that we have with NASA, because I mean, just to be clear, maybe I should have emphasized this more. This is not about not wanting to cooperate anymore. I mean, this stuff is difficult and it's challenging, and definitely we will continue to do space exploration in a cooperative setting. It's about rebalancing the cooperation. It's about cooperating at a more equal level so that we have a say in how to shape the future. And again, that we're not economically dependent and we're not obliged to buy services from non-European companies. Now, this is the what. Another key element, though, is the how. Obviously, we need to do this maybe a little bit different than we've done it in the past. We've seen what NASA has done. They've given us fairly good examples. Not everything is applicable, obviously, from the US to Europe, but certainly we can take inspiration. these new commercial vehicles, both the cargo versions at first and then the crew versions, they were developed through those commercial crew partnership or COTS programs. It means that they gave initial contracts to different companies and they put them in competition with each other. And then there were milestones that they had to meet. And only if they met certain technical milestones, then NASA would give them money for the next step. And some of those companies that got the initial contracts were dropped at some point because NASA realized they're not able to meet their technical milestones. They're never going to make it. So they put companies a little bit in competition with each other, was able to drive down the cost. So this is certainly an approach that we can try and look into in Europe as well, with all the challenges that we have in Europe. Of course, we're not one country, we're many countries, so we have to find a balance and an agreement between probably different interests. So that's definitely a big part of our challenge. But yeah, that's the idea. And we welcome contributions, ideas, thoughts, help in getting the word out. I think that this is really important, and we have no time to waste. No time to waste. I mean, we're going to miss the boat if we don't start now and we really start running. So we welcome all you guys' help.
So thank you. We have no time for other questions. I just want to thank once again Samantha Cristoforetti for being here with us. I want just also to remember that you know, she's an Italian astronaut, and in the discussion we have made in these days here that we have probably to start to think about European astronauts, not Italian or not French and so on. And we, by the way, we have also the Italian first astronaut, Franco Malherbe, here. Okay.
My bad, had not noticed. Ciao, Franco.
I'm sure he has inspired you, by the way, in the past. Yeah?
Oh, absolutely. I remember it like yesterday, the news about the first Italian in space.
Okay. So thank you once again.